Ethan Ward had worked harder jobs than this one, but none that made him feel quite so invisible. He stood near the entrance of the main hall for a moment before the banquet began, just long enough to take it all in. The ship was unlike anything he had ever seen in his life. It was not just a vessel. It was a world. The ceiling stretched so high above him that thin clouds had actually formed near the top, drifting slowly across the artificial sky like pale white smoke. The floor beneath his feet was made of something dark and smooth that reflected the light from 1,000 hanging lanterns, each one a different color, each one belonging to a different species represented at the event. The walls curved outward in great sweeping arches, decorated with banners and symbols that Ethan could not read but understood to be important. Everything about this place was designed to make a single thing very clear, that whoever owned it was more powerful than anyone standing inside it. Ethan adjusted the collar of his uniform, picked up his tray and got to work. He had been hired 3 days ago through a standard low-tier service contract. The agency that placed him had been straightforward about what the job was. A diplomatic banquet. One evening. Good pay by human standards. He would carry trays, refill glasses, remove empty plates and stay out of the way. That last part had been repeated twice, which told Ethan everything he needed to know about how humans were viewed at an event like this. There were about 40 human workers hired for the evening. They moved through the crowd in their matching gray uniforms, heads slightly down, steps quiet and careful. The alien catering supervisors had given them all a very specific briefing before the doors opened. Do not make eye contact with high-ranking guests unless spoken to. Do not speak unless asked a direct question. Do not stop moving. Do not draw attention. Ethan had listened to the whole briefing without saying a word, and when it was over he had simply nodded and picked up his tray like everyone else. The guests began arriving and the hall filled quickly. They came from species Ethan recognized and species he had never seen before. There were tall, narrow beings with 4 arms and silver skin that caught the light every time they moved. There were broad, heavy creatures that walked low to the ground and communicated in deep vibrations Ethan could feel in his chest even when he was standing on the other side of the room. There were species covered in feathers, in scales, in smooth iridescent shells. There were beings that floated slightly above the floor. There were beings that seemed to have no fixed shape at all, shifting slowly as they moved from one group to the next. All of them were important. All of them knew it. And none of them looked at Ethan. He moved through the crowd like water moves around stones, smoothly without resistance, finding the gaps and filling them before anyone noticed he was there. A glass running low, he refilled it without the guest ever looking down. A finished plate left on the edge of a table, he removed it in one clean motion and was gone before the conversation above him continued to the next sentence. He was good at this. Not because the work was difficult, but because Ethan had learned a long time ago how to read a room. That was the thing about being invisible. People assumed it meant you were not paying attention. In Ethan's experience, it was usually the opposite. When nobody watches you, you can watch everything. He noticed which guests were tense and which were relaxed. He noticed the small gestures that passed between delegates from competing species, the slight angle of a head, the barely visible stiffening of a shoulder. He noticed which tables were loud and which ones had gone quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like careful listening. He filed all of it away out of habit, not because any of it had anything to do with him. The Emperor had not yet appeared. His presence was being saved for the midpoint of the evening, Ethan had heard. A formal entrance. Maximum effect. The kind of arrival that reminded every person in the room exactly who was in charge of this galaxy and exactly how much of it belonged to them. The anticipation in the hall was a physical thing. Ethan could feel it pressing against the edges of every conversation, sitting underneath every laugh, tightening the posture of even the most confident-looking delegates. Ethan picked up a fresh tray from the service station along the side wall and moved back out into the crowd. He had been working for about 2 hours when he first noticed the hatchling. He almost missed it. The young dragon was small. Much smaller than Ethan had expected, given everything he had heard about the Vrathkai species. Sirith was barely the size of a large dog, with scales the color of deep amber that caught the light in a way that was almost beautiful. His wings were folded tight against his back and his tail moved in slow, easy sweeps as he padded along the floor, nose low, clearly following some scent or sound that had caught his attention. Ethan slowed his pace slightly without stopping. He had heard that the Emperor was bringing his youngest hatchling to the event. The rumor had passed through the service staff earlier in the evening, accompanied by wide eyes and quiet warnings to be especially careful tonight. A hatchling in the hall meant the Emperor's attention could land anywhere without warning. It meant the stakes of every small mistake had just doubled. Sirith was moving away from the main crowd, drifting toward the quieter edge of the hall near a row of tall decorative columns. His escort, 2 large Imperial guards, were no longer visible. Whether they had lost him in the crowd or simply assumed he would stay close, Ethan could not tell. Either way, the hatchling was alone. Ethan watched him for a moment, then continued his route. It was not his business. He had been told very clearly what his business was, and watching the Emperor's child was not part of it. He moved through the next cluster of guests, refilled 2 glasses, removed a plate and circled back toward the service station. He was almost there when something made him stop. It was the sound. Or rather, it was the change in sound. A few minutes earlier, Sirith had been moving normally, small claws tapping lightly on the floor, tail sweeping, the occasional soft sound that young creatures make when they are curious and comfortable. But now the sound had changed. The movement had stopped. And in its place was something else. Something small and strained and wrong. Ethan turned. Sirith was near the base of one of the decorative columns, and even from this distance Ethan could see that something had shifted. The hatchling's head was lowered too far. His wings had half opened in a way that looked less like a stretch and more like a reflex. His scales, which had been glowing warmly just minutes ago, looked duller now. Flatter. Ethan stood still for exactly 2 seconds. He did not think about the briefing. He did not think about the contract or the rules, or the 2 Imperial guards who should have been watching the hatchling and were not. He did not think about what it meant for a human in a gray service uniform to move toward the Emperor's child in the middle of the most important diplomatic event of the year. He set his tray down on the nearest surface, turned, and walked toward Sirith. The closer he got, the more certain he became. The hatchling's breathing was wrong. It was shallow and uneven, coming in small labored pulls that were clearly costing him effort. His body had settled low to the ground in the way that sick or frightened animals do when they no longer have the energy to hold themselves up. One small eye found Ethan as he approached, and what Ethan saw in it was not fear of a stranger. It was relief. Ethan knelt down beside the hatchling, set one hand gently on the floor in front of him so Sirith could see it clearly, and began to assess what he was dealing with. Behind him, the banquet continued. Glasses clinked. Voices rose and fell. 100 powerful beings from across the galaxy talked and laughed and competed for influence, completely unaware that in the quiet space near the decorative columns, a young human waiter was the only person in the room who had noticed that something was wrong. Nobody was watching Ethan. But Ethan had always been watching everything. Ethan had seen enough to know that whatever was happening to Sirith was getting worse by the second. The hatchling was not panicking. That was almost the most worrying part. Young creatures in distress usually fought. They struggled, they made noise, they pushed back against whatever was hurting them. But Sirith was doing none of that. He was simply getting quieter. Getting smaller. Folding inward in the slow, tired way that told Ethan this had moved past the stage of discomfort and into something more serious. Ethan looked around quickly, trying to understand what had changed in this part of the hall. That was when he noticed the incense. There were 3 large decorative burners placed along the base of the columns in this section of the room. They were tall and beautifully made, carved from dark stone, and they were producing a thick, sweet-smelling smoke that drifted low along the floor before rising slowly toward the high ceiling. Ethan had passed them earlier in the evening without giving them much thought. They were decorative. Ceremonial. The kind of thing that existed at events like this purely for atmosphere. But Sirith had been moving low to the ground. Following a scent, Ethan had thought. Curious, the way young creatures are curious. He had been breathing the smoke directly. Ethan did not know the exact science of it. He did not know the name of the compound burning in those stone vessels or what it did specifically to the internal biology of a young Vrathkai hatchling. What he did know was what he could see in front of him. The hatchling's breathing was becoming more shallow with each passing minute. The amber glow of his scales had faded to something dull and gray at the edges. His small body was trembling in a way that was not cold. It was the fine, persistent trembling of a system under serious stress. Ethan moved closer and gently, carefully, placed his hand near Sirith's nose so the hatchling could breathe something other than the smoke coming off the floor. Sirith blinked at him slowly. That one eye, still tracking, still present, but dimming around the edges in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten. He needed help. Right now. Ethan straightened up and looked toward the main crowd. He could see other staff members moving in the distance. He could see guests. He raised a hand and caught the eye of one of the alien catering supervisors, a tall, narrow-shouldered being named something Ethan could not pronounce, who had spent the entire briefing earlier looking at the human staff like they were mildly inconvenient furniture. The supervisor looked at Ethan. Then looked at the hatchling on the floor. Then looked back at Ethan with an expression that said very clearly, This is not my problem and I am not going to make it my problem. Ethan pointed at Sirith. He pointed at the incense burner. He made the universal gesture for breathing difficulty, hand to throat, urgent expression. The supervisor turned away. Ethan pressed his lips together and looked around again. Word was already beginning to spread, the way word spreads at events like this. Not through announcements but through glances and whispers that move from person to person like a slow fire catching. A few nearby guests had noticed something was happening near the columns. They were drifting closer, forming a loose outer ring, the way people do when they sense an incident but are not yet sure how serious it is. Within 2 minutes that ring had grown. Within 3 minutes it had become a crowd. And not one person in it moved forward. Ethan stood at the center of that growing circle and watched it happen with a feeling he could not quite name. There were alien medics in that crowd. He could identify them by the equipment they carried and the markings on their uniforms. There were senior diplomatic staff. There were personal assistants to some of the most powerful delegates in the galaxy, beings who managed crises for a living and were paid enormous amounts to stay calm under pressure. Every single one of them stood completely still. He heard fragments of conversation from the edges of the circle. Pieces of whispered explanation passing from one person to the next. The words he caught were things like imperial bloodline, physical contact, authorization, protocol, and one phrase that came up more than once and seemed to be carrying the most weight of all, consequences. Ethan looked down at Sirith. The hatchling had stopped lifting his head. He was lying almost flat now, his small sides heaving with the effort of each breath, the trembling in his body becoming more visible. The dull gray had spread further across his scales, pushing the amber warmth back toward the center of his chest like a fire running low on fuel. Ethan understood what was happening in the crowd around him. He was not naive about it. He knew there were rules here that went far beyond anything written in a service contract for a human waiter. The Vrathkai imperial bloodline was not simply important in a political sense. It was sacred, untouchable. The laws surrounding it had been built over centuries and enforced with consequences that most species in this galaxy did not want to test. He understood all of that. He looked at Sirith again. The hatchling's eye found him. Still there. Still holding on. But only just. Ethan knelt down. He did not make a speech about it. He did not announce what he was doing or explain his reasoning to the crowd or ask anyone for permission. He simply went down onto one knee beside the young dragon, placed one hand very gently along the side of Sirith's neck where the scales were warm and began to work. The first thing he did was move the hatchling, carefully, slowly, just far enough away from the base of the column to get him clear of the low drifting smoke. He kept his movements small and deliberate, making sure Sirith could feel that each movement was controlled and intentional. The hatchling did not resist. If anything, the small body leaned into Ethan's hands in a way that made something ache quietly in the back of Ethan's throat. The second thing he did was check the airway. He had learned basic first aid the same way most humans did, in a school classroom from a tired instructor with a plastic dummy and a laminated chart on the wall. He had not thought about that class in years. But the information was there, sitting quietly in the back of his mind the way useful things do when they have been learned properly, and it came forward now without him having to reach for it. The principles were not complicated. Clear the airway. Reduce the irritant. Encourage proper breathing. Keep the patient calm. He tilted Sirith's head back very gently to open the airway fully. He leaned close and breathed slowly and steadily near the hatchling's face, giving him something clean to pull from. He kept one hand resting lightly on Sirith's side so he could feel the breathing and monitor whether it was improving. And he talked. Not because he thought Sirith understood every word, but because he knew from experience that sound mattered when a creature was frightened and struggling. Low, steady sound. Calm sound. The kind that said, "I am here, I am not leaving, you are not alone in this." "Stay with me," Ethan said quietly. "You're going to be fine. Just breathe. Nice and slow. I have got you." The crowd around him had gone completely silent. He was aware of them, the ring of powerful, highly trained, politically cautious beings standing in a perfect circle around him, watching a human in a gray service uniform do the thing that none of them had been willing to do. He did not look at them. He kept his eyes on Sirith and his hands steady and his voice low and even. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. Then something shifted. It was subtle at first, just the faintest change in the rhythm of the hatchling's breathing. A little deeper. A little less labored. The trembling in the small body eased by 1 degree, then another. Ethan felt it through his hand before he could see it clearly. He kept going. Same pace. Same voice. Same steady pressure. Another minute passed. The gray at the edges of Sirith's scales began to pull back. Not fully. Not quickly. But it moved. The amber warmth at the center of his chest grew slightly stronger, pushing outward in slow pulses like something returning from a long way away. Ethan exhaled quietly. It was working. He was so focused on the hatchling that he did not hear the crowd part behind him. He did not hear the heavy footsteps that crossed the floor in long measured strides. He did not notice the shift in atmosphere, the way every being in that circle seemed to pull back slightly, lowering their heads, changing their posture in a single collective movement. He only became aware that something had changed when a shadow fell over him. A very large shadow. Ethan looked up. Emperor Dracothos stood directly above him, eyes fixed on the scene below with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. He was enormous up close, far larger than any image or briefing document had prepared Ethan for. Ancient and cold and completely, utterly still. The entire hall had gone silent. And then, from somewhere deep in the crowd, a single whispered voice said what everyone was already thinking. A human. Just a human waiter. And he was the only one who moved. Ethan did not move. Not because he was frozen with fear, though any reasonable person would have been. But because Siritha's breathing had not yet fully steadied, and Ethan was not the kind of person who stopped doing something important simply because someone important was watching. He could feel the Emperor's presence above him the way you feel a storm coming, not through any single sense but through all of them at once. The air around Dracothos seemed heavier. The light seemed to bend slightly differently near him. Every other living thing in the room had responded to his arrival by becoming smaller, quieter, more careful. Even the ambient noise of the banquet, the distant clinking of glasses, the low murmur of 100 conversations, had died away completely. The silence was enormous. Ethan kept his hand on Siritha's side and kept his breathing slow and steady and kept talking in the same low, calm voice he had been using since he knelt down. "Still with me," he said softly. "Good. Keep going. Nice and slow." He felt Sirith respond to his voice the way the hatchling had been responding for the past few minutes. A slight easing of tension in the small body, a breath that came a little more freely than the one before it. The connection between sound and calm was something Ethan had understood instinctively since he was a child. It did not require explanation. It simply worked. Above him, the Emperor had not spoken. Ethan glanced up once, briefly, directly, and then returned his full attention to Sirith. It was not a gesture of disrespect. It was simply the action of someone who had assessed the situation and made a clear decision about what mattered most in this exact moment. The hatchling needed him present. Everything else could wait. If that decision offended the most powerful being in the galaxy, then it offended him. Dracothos watched this happen. He had arrived expecting many things. He had been told by a member of his guard, in a low, carefully worded message delivered with obvious anxiety, that the hatchling had been found in distress near the decorative columns and that a crowd had gathered. What he had not been told, because the guard had not quite known how to say it, was that a human service worker was already on the floor beside his son, hands moving with quiet confidence, voice steady, completely unbothered by the ring of frozen dignitaries standing around him doing absolutely nothing. Dracothos had ruled for a very long time. He had seen a great many things in that time. He had sat across negotiating tables from species that believed themselves to be the most advanced in the galaxy. He had watched armies move and governments fall and alliances form and dissolve over the course of centuries. He had developed, through all of that experience, a precise and reliable ability to read people quickly. He read Ethan now. What he saw was not what he expected. He had expected fear. Every being that had ever found itself suddenly in close proximity to the Emperor of the Vrathkai showed fear, sometimes hidden, sometimes visible, but always present. It was simply the natural response to proximity to power of that magnitude. Even experienced diplomats who had spent careers preparing for audiences with Dracothos showed it in small ways. A slight change in breathing. A micro-adjustment in posture. A tension in the jaw. Ethan showed none of it. Not because he was unaware of the Emperor standing over him. Dracothos could see clearly that the young human knew exactly who was there. The brief glance upward had been direct and completely without performance. Not a challenge, not a show of courage, just a quick and honest assessment followed by a return to the task at hand. The Emperor found he could not look away. He watched Ethan's hands, how they moved. There was no wasted motion. Every adjustment was small and purposeful. The way he repositioned Siritha's head. The way he kept one palm flat against the hatchling's side to monitor the breathing. The way he maintained a consistent, gentle pressure that communicated safety without restriction. These were not the movements of someone performing competence for an audience. These were the movements of someone who had a clear goal and was working toward it with everything they had. Dracothos shifted his gaze to his son. Siritha's condition was improving. He could see it clearly now, the amber warmth returning to the scales, the breathing finding a steadier rhythm, the fine trembling in the small body easing degree by degree. His son was not out of danger yet, but he was moving away from it. Slowly, consistently, in the direction of safe. Because of the human on the floor beside him. The Emperor looked at the ring of beings surrounding the scene. He let his gaze move across them slowly, taking in each face in turn. Medics, senior diplomatic staff, personal guards, high-ranking delegates from species that had built entire philosophies around the concept of decisive action and superior judgment. Every single one of them standing completely still, watching a young human in a service uniform do the thing that their training, their rank, and their intelligence had failed to move them toward. He did not say anything to them yet. But he did not need to. The observation was enough. He filed it away with the precision of someone who had never once in his life allowed an important piece of information to go to waste. Several more minutes passed. Ethan stayed where he was through all of them, patient and focused, adjusting his approach in small ways as Siritha's condition continued to improve. At one point he shifted position slightly to block a thin drift of smoke that was still curling from the nearest incense burner, putting his own body between the hatchling and the source of the problem without making anything of it. It was such a simple, instinctive gesture that it was almost easy to miss. Dracthos did not miss it. And then something happened that the Emperor had not anticipated. Sirith moved. Not in distress, the opposite of distress. The hatchling lifted his head slowly, turned it toward the human beside him, and with one small foreleg reached up and closed his tiny clawed hand around the sleeve of Ethan's gray uniform. Not a grip of fear. Not a reflex. A deliberate, calm, conscious choice made by a young creature who had decided, with the simple and absolute certainty that only very young things possess, that this was the safest place in the room. The reaction that moved through the watching crowd was immediate and visible. A collective intake of breath. A shifting of posture. Several beings exchanged glances with expressions that mixed shock with something harder to name, something that looked, in some of them, uncomfortably close to shame. Dracthos did not look at the crowd. He was watching his son's face. The hatchling's eyes were clearer now, the amber light in them returning to something close to its normal warmth. Sirith was not looking at his father. He was looking at Ethan with an expression of simple, complete trust that Dracthos recognized immediately because he had spent 3 years watching that expression appear on his son's face in specific circumstances. When Sirith felt genuinely safe, genuinely held, genuinely not alone. His son had never looked that way at a stranger before. The Emperor stood very still for a long moment. He had built his understanding of humanity over centuries of observation and report. Primitive species. Emotional. Reactive. Driven by impulse rather than reason. Useful in certain limited capacities but fundamentally not serious. Not the kind of species that warranted real consideration in the larger structure of galactic affairs. That assessment had felt accurate. It had been consistent with everything he had been shown. He was looking at something right now that did not fit inside that assessment. And Dracthos had not survived as long as he had by ignoring things that did not fit. The royal medics finally stepped forward, moving now that the Emperor was present and could grant the silent authorization their protocol required. The chief medic knelt beside Sirith and conducted a rapid examination, instruments moving quickly and efficiently over the hatchling's small body. After 2 minutes the chief medic looked up at the Emperor and spoke in a low, careful voice. The incense compound had been close to causing irreversible damage to the hatchling's developing flame glands. The intervention, the airway clearance, the repositioning, the clean air, the sustained calm, had been exactly correct and had been applied at exactly the right time. A delay of even a few more minutes would have moved the situation beyond what treatment could fully repair. Dracthos absorbed this information without visible reaction. Then he looked down at Ethan, who was still kneeling on the floor beside Sirith, one sleeve still held firmly in the hatchling's small clawed grip, and who was looking back up at the Emperor with the same calm, direct, honest expression he had worn since the beginning. Not performing bravery. Not calculating advantage. Just a young man on the floor of a grand ship, waiting to see what came next, with the Emperor's son holding onto his sleeve like he had no intention of letting go anytime soon. Dracthos spoke for the first time since entering this part of the hall. His voice was deep and measured and carried to every corner of the silent room without effort. "Your name," he said. "Tell me your name. Your full name. Your homeworld. And your contract number." The crowd held its breath. And Ethan, without flinching, told him. The Emperor did not act immediately. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. There was no dramatic declaration, no sweeping gesture, no instant judgment delivered in front of the frozen crowd. Drake simply looked at him for a long moment after Ethan gave his name, his home world, and his contract number, 3 pieces of information that felt embarrassingly small in the context of where they were being spoken. And then the Emperor turned to his guard and said something in a language Ethan did not understand. 2 guards stepped forward and gently, carefully, took over the care of Sirith from Ethan's hands. Sirith resisted for exactly 1 moment. His small clawed grip on Ethan's sleeve tightened briefly before the hatchling recognized the guards and allowed himself to be lifted. Even then, as he was carried away toward the medical area, he turned his head and kept his eyes on Ethan for as long as he could see him. Ethan stayed kneeling on the floor for a second after they were gone, then quietly stood up, straightened his uniform and waited. He did not know what he was waiting for exactly. He suspected it was not good. He had broken Imperial protocol in front of the most powerful being in the known galaxy and approximately 300 of that galaxy's most important political figures. Whatever came next was unlikely to be simple. What came next surprised him entirely. Drake turned to face the hall. The Emperor did not raise his voice. He never needed to. When he spoke, the quality of his voice was such that it simply reached everywhere, low and deep and carrying the kind of natural authority that cannot be taught or practiced but only possessed. Every conversation in the room had already died. Every eye was already on him. The silence was so complete that Ethan could hear his own heartbeat. Drake spoke in the common galactic language, the shared tongue used at diplomatic events specifically so that every species present could understand without translation. He began by acknowledging what had happened. He described the situation plainly and without embellishment. The hatchling had been in serious danger, the compound had been close to causing permanent damage, and intervention had been required immediately. He did not soften it or dress it up. He stated it as fact, the way someone states facts when they have no interest in managing anyone's feelings about them. Then he said Ethan's name. Not just spoke it, declared it. In the formal Vrathkai manner, with the full weight of Imperial record behind it. He spoke it alongside the ancient phrase that Ethan did not know and could not translate but that caused an immediate visible reaction in every alien delegate who heard it, straightened backs, lowered heads, widened eyes, the particular stillness of beings who have just understood that something historic is happening in front of them. Ethan learned later what the phrase meant. It translated roughly as, this one stood between harm and Imperial blood and is known. In Vrathkai culture it was not simply an acknowledgement. It was a permanent entry into the Imperial record. A declaration that existed for as long as the Empire itself existed. It had been spoken fewer than 40 times in the entire history of the Vrathkai reign, and it had never before been spoken for a human. Ethan did not fully understand what was happening in the moment it happened. He understood that it was serious. He understood from the reaction of the crowd that it was significant. He stood in his gray service uniform in the middle of the grand banquet hall and accepted it the only way he knew how, quietly, with his hands at his sides and his chin up and his expression honest. When it was done, Drake looked at him once more across the hall. You will come with me, the Emperor said simply. When this is finished. It was not a question. The private meeting happened 2 hours later, after the banquet had formally concluded and the diplomatic guests had filtered out in groups, many of them casting long looks back at Ethan as they left. He waited in a small side room off the main corridor, a plain space by the standards of the ship, which still meant it was more impressive than anything Ethan had ever sat inside in his life. He sat on a low bench against the wall and tried not to think too hard about what was coming. A guard came for him and led him through a series of corridors that grew progressively quieter and more private until they reached a large room near the rear of the ship. The room was not decorated the way the banquet hall had been. It was simple and dark and serious, with a long table and high-backed seats and walls that held maps and charts and documents rather than banners and lanterns. A working room. A thinking room. Drake was already there, standing near the far wall, looking at something Ethan could not see clearly. The guard withdrew. The door closed. They were alone. Ethan stood near the entrance and waited. He had decided on the walk over that he was not going to perform anything in this meeting. No carefully chosen words. No calculated humility. No attempt to manage the Emperor's impression of him. He was going to say what was true and let it be whatever it was going to be. Drake turned from the wall and looked at him. Sit, the Emperor said. Ethan sat. Drake did not sit. He moved to the other side of the table and stood there, which put him at a height that was frankly difficult not to be aware of, and studied Ethan for a moment with those ancient, unreadable eyes. You know what you broke tonight, Drake said. It was not a question either. Just a statement laid down like a stone on the table between them. Yes, Ethan said. And you broke it anyway. Yes. The emperor was quiet for a moment. I want to understand why, he said. Not the simple answer. The real one. Ethan thought about it for exactly as long as it took to find the honest words, which was not very long at all. I saw a child who was struggling to breathe, he said. And I knew how to help. That was the whole thing. There was nothing else in it. Those looked at him steadily. You were aware of the protocol. Yes. You were aware of what breaking it could mean for you. I had a rough idea, Ethan said. Yes. And that did not stop you. No. The emperor moved slowly around the side of the table, not in a threatening way, just the movement of someone thinking while their body needed to do something. He stopped a few feet from Ethan and looked down at him with an expression that was difficult to read but was clearly not anger. It was something more complicated than anger. Something that looked, in a strange way, almost like effort, like a very old and very certain mind working hard against the edges of something it had not expected to find there. I have ruled for a long time, Those said quietly. In that time I have sat across from presidents and generals and high priests and philosophers. I have had beings tell me extraordinary things about honor and sacrifice and the value of life. He paused. Most of them were telling me because they wanted something. Ethan nodded slowly. He did not say anything. You want nothing, the emperor said. It came out sounding almost like an accusation but not quite. I would quite like to keep my job, Ethan said honestly. Something shifted in the emperor's expression. It was very brief and very subtle and it was gone almost before it arrived, but Ethan caught it. A small movement at the corner of that vast, ancient face that might, in another context, have been the beginning of something that was almost amusement. Your job, Those repeated. I need the money, Ethan said simply. I have rent. The emperor looked at him for a long moment. And then something happened that Ethan suspected had not happened in that room in a very long time. The rigid, careful, centuries-old stillness in Those shifted. Not dramatically, not completely, but genuinely. Something underneath the surface of all that power and history moved in a way that was small and real and impossible to fake. You saw a child, the emperor said quietly, almost to himself. That is all you saw. That is all there was to see, Ethan said. Those was silent for a long time after that. Long enough that the room felt very still and very full at the same time. When he finally spoke again his voice was lower than it had been before, less the voice of an emperor and more the voice of something older and more private than a title. I have dismissed your species for centuries, he said. I had reasons that felt sound. He paused. I am finding tonight that sound reasons are not always complete ones. Ethan did not respond to that. There was nothing to say that would have improved it. He just sat quietly and let the emperor's honest words exist in the room between them, the way honest words deserve to exist, without being rushed past or covered over or explained away into something more comfortable. Outside, the great ship moved through the dark between stars. And inside, something that had been fixed for a very long time had begun, quietly, to change. The decree did not come the next morning. It came 3 days later, which Ethan spent in a quiet guest quarters aboard the Emperor's flagship, not entirely sure if he was a guest or something closer to a detainee. The room was comfortable in the way that all things on this ship were comfortable, far beyond anything his own life had prepared him for. The bed was wide and soft. The food that appeared at regular intervals was varied and good. A window the size of a wall showed him the slow movement of stars outside, drifting past in long pale streaks as the ship traveled between systems. Nobody told him anything during those 3 days. Guards stood outside his door, not blocking it, not threatening, just present. Staff brought meals and exchanged polite nods with him and left without conversation. One of the Emperor's lower assistants came on the second day to ask if he needed anything, and when Ethan asked what was happening, the assistant smiled carefully and said that things were being arranged and that he should rest. Ethan rested. He sat by the enormous window for long hours and watched the stars and thought about his apartment back home, which was small and slightly cold in the mornings and had a kitchen tap that had been dripping for 2 months. He thought about the agency that had placed him on this contract and wondered if they had any idea where he currently was. He thought about Sirith, whether the hatchling had recovered fully, whether the amber warmth had returned completely to those small scales. On the morning of the 3rd day the assistant came back and told him the Emperor was ready. The hall where the decree was delivered was different from the banquet hall. It was smaller but in some ways more impressive, designed not for celebration but for record. The walls were lined with carved panels that Ethan understood, from their weight and age, to be historical documents. The floor was a single piece of dark stone, undecorated, serious. Light came from above in clean vertical shafts that fell on a raised platform at the front of the room. The audience was smaller than the banquet crowd but somehow more intense. These were not guests or diplomats passing through. These were permanent figures, senior members of the imperial court, heads of major galactic councils, representatives of the species that sat at the center of galactic power and had done so for a very long time. They stood in formal rows and watched Ethan walk in with the contained, careful attention of people who had been told something significant was about to happen and were not yet sure how to feel about it. Ethan stood where he was directed to stand and waited. Drake entered from a side door and took his place on the platform. The room performed the formal gestures of acknowledgement, heads lowered, a specific stillness held for a specific number of seconds, and then straightened and waited. The Emperor spoke. He began with history, the way Vrathkai formal proceedings always began, a recounting of the relevant past, delivered in plain language that left no room for interpretation. He described the current classification system. He described humanity's place within it. Category 3. Primitive Observation Status. A designation that had been in place for as long as the Vrathkai had been aware of humanity's existence, reviewed periodically and consistently maintained. He described what it meant in practical terms. Restricted travel authorization in 17 major star systems. Exclusion from permanent representation on 4 of the 6 primary galactic councils. Trade limitations that capped human economic participation at a fraction of what other recognized species were permitted. A legal status that placed humans below the threshold required for certain basic protections under galactic law. He listed these things in the same flat, factual voice he used for everything. Not with guilt. Not with apology. Simply as facts that needed to be stated clearly before what came next could be understood properly. Then he described what had happened at the banquet. He described it completely and without embellishment, the same way Ethan imagined he described everything, as a sequence of events that had occurred and could not be undisposed of. The hatchling in danger. The crowd that did not move. The human who did. The outcome that resulted directly from that single decision made by a single person in a gray service uniform with a tray of glasses and no political rank whatsoever. He said Ethan's name again. Formally. With the full weight of the declaration he had made in the banquet hall, now entered permanently into the official record of this proceeding. And then he announced the reclassification. Humanity. Category 1. Recognized sovereign species. Effective immediately. The room was very still for a moment. Then it was not still at all. The response was not chaos. These were too disciplined a group for chaos, but it was immediate and it was significant. Ethan watched faces change around him in real time. Watched the calculations happening behind careful eyes as beings who had spent careers operating within a specific political structure suddenly had to begin rebuilding their understanding of how that structure now looked. Category 1 status carried specific and non-negotiable legal weight. It could not be quietly ignored or slowly diluted through procedural delay. The Emperor's word was the foundation of galactic law in this part of the universe, and the Emperor had just spoken. One delegate near the back of the room, from a species Ethan did not recognize, leaned to the being beside them and whispered something urgent. Another representative had gone very still in the way that people go still when they are doing rapid mental arithmetic about consequences. A senior council member near the front kept their expression completely neutral but gripped the edge of their formal robe with both hands in a way that suggested the neutrality was costing them something. Ethan stood in the middle of all of it and felt something strange move through him. Not pride exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that felt more like the particular sadness of understanding, for the first time with his whole body rather than just his mind, exactly how much had been taken from his species for exactly how long. The list Drake had read out was not abstract to him. He had lived inside those restrictions his entire life without ever having the full language for what they were. Travel limitations he had assumed were just the way things worked. Economic ceilings he had been told were natural. Doors that did not open for humans that he had learned not to stand in front of. He had not known they were laws. He pressed his lips together and kept his face steady and listened to the rest. The second part of the Emperor's announcement was shorter but in some ways landed harder. Drake stated that his son had demonstrated, in the clear and observable way that young creatures demonstrate things, a specific and consistent response to the presence of one Ethan Ward. The hatchling's recovery had been monitored closely over the 3 days since the banquet. In that time Sirith had been evaluated by the Imperial medical staff and had received visits from his regular caregivers and members of the royal household. He had been calm and cooperative during all of it. But 3 times during those 3 days, at unpredictable intervals, Sirith had become agitated without visible cause. Restless. Unsettled. Unwilling to be soothed by the usual methods. On each occasion the attending staff had noted the behavior and reported it. On each occasion the behavior had continued until it was resolved. It had been resolved each time by a member of the household staff who had thought to bring Ethan's service uniform jacket, left behind in the medical area on the night of the banquet, and place it near the hatchling. Sirith had settled immediately. Every time. The Emperor delivered this information in the same flat, factual tone he used for everything else, as though the detail of his son calming down because of a gray service jacket belonging to a human waiter was simply another piece of data to be processed and acted upon. Which Ethan supposed was exactly how Drakethos treated everything. The role of companion guardian was therefore being created and offered to Ethan Ward, to be accepted or declined at his own discretion, with full understanding of what it entailed and full freedom to refuse without consequence. Drakethos looked at Ethan directly when he said the last part. The look was brief but clear. The offer was genuine. The freedom to refuse was genuine. The Emperor did not pressure through implication. That particular tool was apparently beneath him. Ethan thought about his apartment. The dripping tap. The cold mornings. The agency that had sent him to carry trays on a ship the size of a small city. He thought about Siritha's small clawed hand gripping his sleeve. "I accept," he said. The room stirred again. And somewhere deeper in the ship, in a warm medical suite lined with soft amber light, a small dragon lifted his head, his scales glowing steadily, and made a sound that the attending staff had not heard him make once in 3 days. Come. Easy. Content. Like something had just come back that he had been quietly waiting for all along. Years have a way of moving faster than you expect when your life has changed completely. Ethan had not fully understood, when he accepted the role of companion guardian on that quiet morning in the formal hall, exactly what the years ahead would look like. He had known it would be different from carrying trays. He had known it would involve the hatchling and the ship, and a life structured around an imperial household rather than a service agency back home. He had understood the broad shape of it. What he had not understood was how much of it would simply feel like being a person. Not a symbol. Not a representative of his species. Not the human who saved the Emperor's son and changed galactic history. Just a person who woke up in the morning and had responsibilities he cared about and a routine that became familiar, and a small dragon who grew, gradually and then suddenly, from a hatchling who fit in his arms into a young Vrathkai who could look him almost in the eye. Sirith grew the way all living things grow, in the quiet stretches between events, in the daily accumulation of small moments that do not feel significant while they are happening and then turn out to have been everything. Ethan taught him things that no imperial tutor would have thought to include in a formal curriculum. How to be still when something was frightening instead of reacting immediately. How to listen to what someone was not saying as carefully as what they were. How to sit with a problem long enough to understand it before trying to solve it. How to notice the people that everyone else was looking past. That last one Sirith took to with a particular intensity that made Ethan quietly proud every time he saw it in action. The young dragon had a habit as he grew older of stopping to speak to the service staff on the ship, the workers that high-ranking visitors walked past without acknowledgement, the maintenance crew in their plain uniforms, the beings who kept everything running and were invisible because invisibility was what their position required. Sirith did not make a performance of it. He simply stopped and spoke to them the way Ethan had always spoken to everyone, directly, with genuine attention, like what they had to say was worth hearing. The Imperial household staff noticed. They did not comment on it officially. But Ethan caught the looks that passed between them when Sirith did it, and he knew what those looks meant. Drakethos changed slowly. That was the honest way to describe it. He did not transform overnight. He did not make a public announcement about his revised understanding of humanity and deliver a speech about past errors and future intentions. That was not how the Emperor operated, and Ethan had understood that fairly quickly. What Drakethos did was act differently than he had acted before. The policy changes that followed the reclassification decree were extensive and had been expected. The legal and political machinery of galactic governance moved to implement Category 1 status for humanity across all the systems and councils where it applied, and that process was enormous and complicated and took years of careful work. But those changes had weight behind them, the Emperor's consistent, quiet, immovable backing every time a council tried to delay or a species with vested interests tried to introduce procedural obstacles. Drakethos never raised his voice about it. He never needed to. He simply made his position clear each time it was tested, in the flat factual tone that left no room for negotiation, and the obstacles tended to move. Ethan was not present for most of those political proceedings. His life was aboard the ship with Sirith. But news reached him, and he followed it with the particular attention of someone who understood what the numbers and policy documents represented in real human lives. Travel restrictions lifted. Trade access opened. Representation seats filled for the first time by human delegates who had spent careers being told those seats were not for them. He thought sometimes about the people back home who would never know where those changes had come from. A hatchling near a decorative column. A drifting cloud of sweet-smelling smoke. A waiter who set down his tray. History almost always looked like something else while it was happening. Ethan was in his 50s when Sirith addressed the Galactic Assembly for the first time as a full adult representative of the Vrathkai Empire. He watched from a private viewing area off the main chamber, a small room with a wide window that looked down onto the assembly floor below. He had been offered a seat in the formal gallery and had politely declined. This was not his moment and he had no interest in being visible in it. He just wanted to watch. The chamber was enormous. It seated representatives from every recognized species in the known galaxy, hundreds of delegations arranged in curved tiers that rose from the central floor like the inside of a vast shell. The noise before the session opened was a layered, complex thing, dozens of languages and communication styles overlapping in a sound that was somehow both chaotic and purposeful. When Sirith entered the chamber, the noise did not stop immediately. He was not the Emperor. He did not command silence simply by being present the way Dracothos did. What he commanded instead was attention. A gradual, spreading shift in the room as delegations noticed him and turned, and the noise settled into something quieter and more focused. He had grown into something remarkable. Ethan watched him cross the floor and take his position at the speaker's platform and felt the strange combination of pride and distance that comes from watching someone you helped raise become fully themselves. Sirith was not what Ethan had made him. Sirith was what Sirith had always been, given space and time and the particular influence of a human who had tried, simply and consistently, to show him what mattered. The address began formally, greetings, acknowledgements, the procedural language of galactic diplomacy that Sirith had mastered completely. Ethan listened to it with half his attention and watched the chamber with the other half. Then Sirith set the formal language aside. It was a subtle shift, a change in cadence, in the particular quality of attention in the room that told you something different was happening now. Sirith's voice, which had deepened considerably in the years of his growing, settled into something that was neither performance nor politics but simply a person saying true things in front of people who needed to hear them. He talked about strength. He said that he had grown up inside one of the most powerful empires in the known galaxy, surrounded by beings of enormous capability and authority, and that for a long time he had understood strength the way most of the galaxy understood it, as the quality that made others step back, look down, move out of the way. The kind of strength that was measured by the size of the shadow it cast. He said that a human had taught him something different. He did not over-explain it. He did not tell the whole story in detail. He had told it before in smaller contexts, and he knew that the broad shape of it was already known to most of the beings in this chamber. Instead he said simply that there was a person who had walked through a crowd of frozen, powerful, capable beings and knelt on the floor beside a frightened child because the child needed help. And that person had not done it for recognition or record or political advantage. He had done it because it was the obvious thing to do. And then Sirith said the words that Ethan heard clearly even through the window of his small private room. He said that the strongest thing he had ever seen was not a weapon or an army or a political decree. It was a pair of steady hands and a quiet voice in a moment when everyone else had calculated the cost and decided it was too high. True strength, he said, is not what makes others afraid. It is what makes others feel safe. The chamber was quiet for a moment after he said it. Then it was not quiet at all. Ethan was asked, in an interview given some years after the assembly address, to describe what had happened that night on the flagship. The interviewer was a young human journalist, barely older than Ethan had been at the banquet, who asked the question with the kind of genuine curiosity that had not yet been worn smooth by years of professional practice. She asked him how he had done it. How he had walked through that frozen crowd and knelt beside the Emperor's son when nobody else would move. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Not because the answer was complicated, but because simple answers deserve a moment before you give them so they land the way they should. Then he smiled. Everyone else in that room was thinking about themselves, he said. What it would cost them. What might happen to them. What the rules said about them. He paused. I was just thinking about the kid. The journalist wrote it down. And somewhere across the galaxy, in the long memory of the Imperial record, a name sat permanently in the ancient Vrathkai script. A human name, entered beside a phrase that meant this one stood between harm and Imperial blood, quiet and permanent and unhurried, the way true things tend to be. Not every person who changes history knows they are doing it. Some of them are just trying to help a child breathe.